clip, who does not believe in taper.
It's a softer taper. It's just softer.
Yeah, I just gave it. I mean, it's for a sprint, so I gave them a very soft taper. Cool. They get a day off.
And people race much better when they don't taper that much. You only need a little bit of freshness.
It's a shake the rust off race. So yeah. I think they, a rest day right before is good, but that's they don't need that much taper to shake off the rust.
No. Tis better to be fit. All right.
I'll be there, so I don't get to taper. They don't get to taper.
All right, guys. Tonight's topic, coaching with intervals, something that we all need to be very well versed in, and everybody is pretty much darn familiar with this concept. Aren't too many workouts that we all get to give our athletes or even do ourselves that don't have intervals. And intervals play a pretty vital role in just about everything we do as coaches to get our athletes to work different energy systems. So, I think a little bit of background on how that works and why we do it is important. Before I kind of kick into this topic specifically, any questions on anything we also had from last week? I know sometimes when you're going through the questionnaire, you may find, or the questions, you may find stuff that comes up that you wanted to ask me, but we can also table it for after the discussion too. You guys just let me know. All right, and I will move on. So coaching with intervals, we've got kind of an overview, intervals for our athletes by their ability, intervals by duration, intervals by intensity, intervals based by distance, and we're going to go through a couple examples of what we're doing with our athletes and some use cases. And so I'm going to try to keep the interval subject relatively broad because just like anything, you can kind of dive into it pretty specifically. But for more, conversations about specific training plans and specific athletes, rather than go really, really direct, I'm going to kind of give some broad brush strokes on just how to apply and work with intervals in general. All right, so as an overview, intervals are basically used to train specific energy systems, whether it's your aerobic capacity, neuromuscular capacity, muscular endurance, and our beginner athletes rarely, if ever, need some high intensity interval work. So VO2 max work is going to be rare for them due to mainly the higher risk of injury and their lack of aerobic capacity. So we're using intervals essentially to trick the body, and we're doing it in such a way that gives us an opportunity to kind of go after one specific area and then come back down and go after another area, and those repeated doses we keep stacking together to achieve an end goal. Sometimes that's endurance, sometimes that's threshold work, and as we see, we change the work to rest relationships and we get different outputs and intensities, which is really critical towards bringing the body into shape. I love intervals. If you become a real, kind of master of creating plans and workouts, you start to get to really understand that the devil's in the details, and that these small changes that you guys see every week, even the shortening the rest time or increasing the interval length or increasing the intensity, have a pretty dramatic consequence. And it doesn't take much to get a desired effect just by changing things very slightly. A lot of times you'll see plans that go from 0 to tons of intervals, or the progression is not very thought out or logical, but we have the ability to really track things and get very precise with our intervals, and we like to back our athletes way out with the interval work so that they know what they're doing, and the body can experience it and compress it in a much better time frame. So high intensity intervals are they're taxing mentally and physically, and beginners and intermediates will need to do them and timed well, and increasing somewhat towards peak. So just like everything, there is kind of a progression that starts and moves us towards this peak fitness level. And our intervals also do the same, very much so. So you run the risk of, really nuking your athletes mentally if you can't have them be able to hack these hard intervals all the time. Now, the rest periods may also help them get towards being able to sustain this more increasingly. But we'll talk about the different goals of our athletes and why sometimes it's more advantageous for them not to have them at all, and when they really need them the most. Intervals, they don't need to be intense. Sometimes they need to be. We break up workouts just to keep the brain and the body guessing. I'll throw in a little story. This past weekend, working with our Ultraman athletes, Ted and Julian. Julian was really starting to struggle. It was about mile 42 where he really wanted to just kind of walk a bunch more and not kind of follow the pattern. The pattern was just getting kind of boring. And so I was jogging with him. I ran about 22 miles of it on and off throughout the day, and his team, ran a bunch of it too. And when I was running with him, I said, I want you to count. I want you to count one Mississippi up to 50. And then when you get to one, he goes, I counted to 50. He goes, and I said, well, when you get to 50, you say one Mississippi, two Mississippi, and then you say it out loud when you get to 50. So he gets to 50, and I said, count back from 50. So he counts back from 50. And then he finishes that. And I said, all right, I want you to count one Ironman Hawaii's all the way up to 200. So in his head, he's counting up to 200, saying Ironman Hawaii 1, Ironman Hawaii 2, Ironman Hawaii 3. And so literally, his brain is constantly engaged, and he can't start thinking about the suffering of it. And that stochastic nature really breaks things up. So intervals, when our brain perceives things, very consistently, and we know what to expect, then it's harder to get a leveraged effect. So sometimes it's going to be important for you to let your athletes see different things. You'll note in the TriStar plans, a lot of times I really give a lot of different variables. I throw a lot of different things at people. I don't give the exact same thing every week, even though there's quite a bit of a repetition to some things. So kind of interesting to see how that went. And oh, by the way, we did that whole counting thing, and he messed up a whole bunch of times for almost 2 hours. I mean, literally 2 hours, and it was pretty interesting. We went through all of his family members, counting his family members. We did all the different Ironman races that he's done. It was pretty cool, and I'm sure he's like counting sheep in his sleep nowadays. All right, intervals help your athletes, as I mentioned, to break up a session, and it compresses them in a better way. The athlete who has never done intervals, guys, they have a lot to unleash. Every once in a while, you're going to meet a newer athlete who says, I just go out there and I just do stuff. And that's amazing, because that athlete has huge potential. And you'll hear that a lot in the pool. You'll hear that an awful lot in the pool. Bear in mind, most racing is done as steady state and an even output. And while we do intervals in training that are also very helpful, specific sessions may require long or very steady intervals. Intervals of pacing, actually. So just because we use the word interval because it just breaks something up. It could be even steady state, where you're going up a little bit higher, coming back down, and it can be continuous. But that's still interval work as you think of it. Okay. We are now moving into intervals by athlete ability. Looks like my screen is a little bit frozen. Can you guys see intervals by athlete ability on there? It's like the back of my screen is frozen, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is, right? Yeah.
I'm following along separately, though.
Okay, hang on. Let me see if I can figure out what's going on here. It's exciting. What's your favorite intervals? Each one of you, tell me what your favorite intervals are.
Oh, how could you pick?
Well, that's why I asked.
My all-time favorite is 5 minutes on the treadmill fast with 1 minute jumping off, and do many of them.
So that's like the 5x1 repeats, Attila?
Huh?
Meaning like the 5x1 repeats, that one?
Yes, and going up in pace very gradually.
Yeah, I have to say I like that one a lot. That's one of my favorites, the 5x1, where you completely stop.
Yes, you just jump off and then catch your breath if you've got any left,
Yeah,
and then go to the next one. Yeah.
yeah, that's definitely one of my favorites too. All right.
I think you have to figure out what is so sweet about the sweet spot. The first time I had one of those, I was like, oh, sweet spot. And then I was like, hold on. This is not so sweet.
Well, the bitter spot.
It should be called the bittersweet then. Bittersweet intervals. All right. Let's see if this will be a backup plan here.
I really like underovers on the bike, and I really like the kitchen sink on the bike because it generally means you got like, first of all, the warm up always feels like it takes forever, and then it's like, oh my god, there's no way I can do that. Like literally, you look at it, and I'm like, he's crazy. I cannot do those. And then it's like, oh, I did that, but I'm too tired to do it again. And then it's like, but it's only one, it's only one or two more times. I can do that, so. And I really like the run walk where it's like, run as fast as you can for 30 seconds. And it's like, I can't run that fast. And it's like, yes, you can. So I like it. It's surprising.
It's tricky.
All the intervals taught me was like, oh, you can pretty much do anything for 30 seconds, anything. And I was like, oh, you can pretty much do anything for a minute. And I was like, oh, you can pretty much do anything for 3 minutes,
Yeah.
And now it's like, so that doesn't look so bad.
All right, so intervals.
I like doing when I have athletes that like I had Liz said to me the other day, she goes, oh, I really like this run walk thing because like when I'm running, I'm actually running faster than I've ever run before. I'm like, I know, right? She's like, this is fun. I feel speedy.
Yeah. It's cool.
I'm like, that's the trick.
And the reality is if you stack all those intervals together, eventually it does raise the stamina and the potential of that athlete. So that is really cool. So speaking of intervals by athlete and their ability, so our level A and C, level A to C athletes, so our beginner to advanced, they all use intervals. Everybody's going to use intervals. It's not like we say, hey, these athletes just don't need intervals. Everybody's going to use them to some extent. That's really one of the number one things we have as coaches to play around with to make our athletes better. And I will say that, look, most of the interval work that you will find on the web, it's pretty much been done, right? Every coach has gone out and created some sort of interval work that's out there, different patterns for different things. So there's nothing like relatively proprietary to like interval training, but how you put it all together, that is really what makes, things very unique to, a sophisticated training plan. And so that's something that you should keep in mind. Beginner athletes rarely, if ever, need VO2 max work. I think I mentioned that earlier in the beginning. Two, I think I mentioned all this. I think this slide looks a little bit repetitive here. Hold on. Advanced athletes can leverage consistent high FTP work. Okay, I didn't mention this. So our level C athletes, and I always call them out a little bit because they do have some uniqueness to them, and they are advanced and our pro athletes. And they are going to be able to leverage more consistent and higher FTP work beyond, more than even one regular session a week. There's kind of this 80-20 rule where not 80% of the work is done, at aerobic levels and 20% at threshold, but the number of sessions. So 80% of your sessions would be done in an aerobic way, and 20% would be done in a anaerobic way potentially, or threshold way potentially. More than that, and people are going to get nuked. So we also start to look at the total accumulated work that can be done for our athletes, and so our A and our B athletes are going to sustain less than that. They're going to sustain a lot less intensive work And I'd even say a lot of the year they may be in this 90% base, and sub-threshold type of intervals, and maybe only one session a week is of this very high nature that has, even neuromuscular capacity, short, very high intense intervals, if at all. And then our B-level athletes may have some smattering of those kinds of sessions throughout their training. Okay, now we're getting into the intervals and their duration. So very short intervals consist of less than 30 seconds. They're usually very high intensive in nature. They may be used for more low intensity work such as walk runs, as you guys know. And for swimming, it's very common to have these types of durations. We see much shorter intervals in the pool to break it up because swimming can be a lot more like on the gerbil wheel if you're not, breaking things up a bit. And also the breathing aspect is a little more technical there. Intervals of this type of short duration high intensity are used to work your neuromuscular capacity, and as I've written here, it's the ability to create a fast muscle movement, fast twitch muscles. So it's like literally how fast can you get your muscles to fire when you are working out. And that's important for developing fast twitch muscles and retaining fast twitch muscles, and we don't want to lose that. We don't want to lose that with our athletes because oftentimes if we're doing such a large work rate of this low intensity work, we'll tend to find that athletes do something really well, and that is whatever it is they're given to do, they're going to do it well, and that is go slow. So if you tell them to go long and slow, they're going to be very long and slow. So if you don't mix in the energy systems and the stimulus, then you're going to find your athletes will may be more durable and they may be able to go longer, but they're not going to develop and get faster, or at least bring all the energy systems up together. So 1 minute and up to 5 minute long intervals are used for VO2 max output intensity, and this is more common in our cyclists and our advanced triathletes, and our swimmers may use these longer intervals as well. 10 to 20 minute intervals are used for sub-threshold work or less, steady state riding or over-unders. This can be, a lot of focus remaining in this area. I think that our athletes can sustain a lot more in those periods, and that's why we use things like kitchen sink and 90% to 95% of FTP, because it's not such a mental commitment. We find that athletes really start to suffer when they get into that perceived effort of an 8 and higher, where the mental cost for that is a lot. So perceived effort of 6 and 7 is a really great place to spend a lot of quality time. So as I said, common for cycling, somewhat common for long distance runners, very common for ultra distance triathletes such as Ironman, and some solid, whoops, I'm gonna leave that last piece out. I think that was old note. Looks like I copy and pasted some of my notes here, guys, sorry about that. And then my last bit is the 20-minute plus long intervals, which are typically zone 3 or less and aerobic in nature. These really tend to only be, exclusive to your some marathon training plans. You'll see that. You'll see it in a lot of Ironman training plans. 70.3 training plans is 20 minutes plus, but they tend to be, as I mentioned, aerobic in nature. If you're having athletes do these types of long intervals and you're telling them to hold 70% of FTP for 20 minutes and they're blowing through their threshold heart rate, that is not a good idea. You want to bring them back, and then you're going to have to refocus them in on holding for a specific heart rate and capping it, because those types of intervals are going to be like races if you're not careful. So interval length and duration, you still have to consider the aerobic nature of it and how long your athletes are going to be in that aerobic zone with their heart rate. Advanced athletes won't have to worry about this. Your B-level athletes may or fall in or out of this depending upon how fit they are, what time of the season it is. But, things like heart rate caps and perceived effort caps are going to keep a lid on it for the most part in a lot of the sessions. Okay, intervals and intensity. Short intervals, they can go from 80 to 250%. Our 10 to 20 minute interval range in intensity can be from 70 to 105%. And our 20 plus minute range can be in intensity from 55 to 95%. More commonly, I wrote in there 65 to 80% of FTP. So that's a pretty big, broad range when you think about it. And it's a pretty broad range in terms of how many minutes you could give somebody. And so if you start to think about all the infinite combinations of possibilities, right, there is a lot of creativity, and that's why a lot of times you hear, coaching is an art, and there is some art to it. But fortunately, we have the levelizer, I would call it levelizer, which is Training Peaks and the ability to look at stress management and know, okay, well, if I produce a workout that is really wonky and crazy and has all this great stuff in it and it's hard, how does that fit into my athlete's, week, season plan, for that matter, or day to day? So I think it's fun to have intervals. It's kind of like you've got lots of different crayons in your crayon box, and it's a big crayon box, and that's why I like intervals a lot. Okay, intervals based on distance. So I broke this down by running and multi-sport for the most part. And so we're going to start off with triathlon here. So sprint, we're talking moderate intensity intervals are going to range from 15 to about 45 minutes in duration. Our high intensity intervals are going to range from about 1 minute to 10 minutes. Our Olympic distance moderate intensity intervals are going to range from 20 to 45 minutes. That's more typical for like the bike, and also sometimes the run. And our high intensity intervals are going to range from 5 to 15 minutes as well for the Olympic distance. Half is going to range from 20 to 90 minutes for moderate intensity. And when I'm saying moderate intensity, I'm talking about RPE of generally a 6. We're talking 80% of FTP plus or minus, let's say 78 to about 88% of FTP. And then high intensity intervals for 70.3 ranging from 5 to 20 minutes in duration. You'd probably see more typically 15 to 20 minutes because, again, the distances are longer. So you need to make sure that you're stacking them up and the athlete has the ability to tolerate things. Really common is to see 20 minutes at, for instance, 70.3 race pace, maybe 10 minutes at Olympic race pace, and then drop down to Ironman race pace for like another 30 minutes, and do that as a long run, like a long ride that is, and stack all those intervals together so that you're seeing something that actually qualifies even more than what you would see slightly as your biggest ride before your race. So when you're looking at the workouts in the plans, what I'm generally doing and what we're seeing in the plans is trying to build up that training stress every week. And if it's a 70.3, for instance, and we're talking about just the bike leg, which is 180 training stress points, roughly, then you're going to see maybe the first week it starts out at 130, then it's 140, then it's 150, and then the next block it goes 150, 160, 180, 200, and then the final two, maybe key long rides are at 180 goal TSS, but they're much harder with all these intervals. So that's what's kind of neat. And knowing your audience is really important to figure out how to apply these intervals. And it's inherent in the plans, but at the same time, it's good for you to know, well, I have an athlete and they're beginner, does it make sense for me to give them 5-minute, very high threshold work, on the run? Probably not. Does it make sense for me to give it to a C level or a B level athlete? B, maybe. C level, absolutely. Yeah. So when it comes to Ironman tries, moderate intensity intervals are going to really range. They're going to be from 30 to 120 minutes. It's going to be really long intervals. High intensity intervals are going to range from 5 to 30 minutes, so they're still actually fairly similar to what we see in 70.3. But the shorter you go, usually the more intense it is, which means it's reserved more so for our high performers there for the most part. Questions on any of that so far? Intervals? Okay, you're all muted. It's all good. You're all talking to me, but you're just muted. I'll keep going.
Is it possible, just theoretically, that you train up to the full distance just by doing intervals? So you add up the intervals, and then they will add up to the distance or the duration, and so you never did it kind of continuously.
Yes. So you may see, it depends on the athlete, Attila. So the beginner athletes, right, they may only have a band for their longest. Let's just use a long ride as an example for a 70.3. They may only stay in a certain range, like let's call it 70 to 80% of FTP, their whole long ride. On race day, whatever their highest intensity factor is, that's what you're going to start with as your pacing strategy. So if they sustain maximally 75% of FTP for that 56-mile bike ride or so, then you're going to think to target somewhere around 72 or 71, a little bit less, so that they have more to get off and run well. Now, when you're building up the workouts, and we'll get into a lot more of this in next year, but you're basically trying to get a little bit more load than what they're going to see on race day. So 180, let's say, is the training stress for 70.3. 200 is a great place to start. Make sure that they have at least that. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes athletes don't want to go longer, and some don't have the capacity to go harder. So you have the option of either giving folks, and you'll see in the more beginner plans, they're going to have longer rides. They're going to have much longer rides to get the training stress. They'll have 4 hours as their long ride for half Ironman, whereas the advanced and the C-level folks are going to have more like 2.5 hours as their long ride, but they're hard. They're really hard.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Good question. All right. Next up, intervals based on distance for the swim. If you're doing swimming races less than 500 yards, we're talking about mostly 25-yard intervals, 500-yard intervals as the range. 1K swim races are generally done somewhere between 50 yards and 1,000 yards is going to be your
Did we skip the run, or did I fall
Did I
asleep?
go back?
No, somehow he jumped over the run.
Yeah, no, okay, so
That's all right, I'll go back. I think I clicked twice. Got a sticky finger over here today, and my tech is a little funky. Okay. So your swim, 1.2 mile swim is going to be generally 50 to about 1,000 yards, very similar to a 1K swim. 2.4 miles, Ironman swims are generally going to be hundreds and up to 2,000 yards is what we use as the intervals in the base there. Okay, going back over to running. 5K races, so your moderate intervals are going to be from about 10 to 45 minutes in duration. Or 2-mile repeats, up to 2-mile repeats. That's rare. It's much more rare to have 2-mile repeats. That's more of an advanced thing. But I think you'll see a lot more like quarter mile, even 200-meter repeats sometimes. So your 10 second to 15 minutes, that's pretty typical for 5K distances, and 200-meter to 1-mile repeats is common for intervals for your 5Ks. 10K races for moderate intensity intervals are going to range from about 10 to 45 minutes. Or that's going to equate to about a half-mile repeat, or up to even your 10K type of repeats. High intensity intervals for a 10K prep is going to have 15 seconds to 20 minutes. In terms of range for your moderate stuff can be, there's a blend of this. I don't want to hard code this exactly, but I do want you guys to have an idea of where the bulk of all these types of repeats are happening. So your fast stuff is going to be 200-meter up to 2-mile repeats. Again, I put the 2-mile in there. I want you guys to know, put a star on it, or make a note for yourselves that that's a long repeat when you're thinking about doing stuff for 10Ks. It's a very long run interval. And only people who have really, really good form can do those types of repeats without injury. Okay, now, half marathon races, moderate intensity intervals are going to range from about 10 minutes to 90 minutes, and your high intensity intervals are going to range from about 1 minute to 20 minutes. So pretty big range there, and distance-wise, we're talking about 400-meter and up to 2-mile repeats. Again, pretty challenging there. 1.5-mile repeats can actually get the job done pretty well. So even though I'm giving you again the range, just know that it's a continuum, and you need to slot in there and decide, based on the athlete, their experience level, what is an appropriate interval to give them. And so, just because they're tougher and they want to be more of a more advanced athlete doesn't mean that you need to give them long intervals for it to be effective. So it's really important to kind of wrap your brain around. Marathons, well, moderate intensity intervals are going to range from 10 minutes up to 180 minutes, or your 1 mile, we're talking to 10 mile types of repeats, and high intensity intervals are going to range from approximately a minute and up to 30 minutes, and you're talking 400 meters up to 2 mile repeats once again. Questions on any of that so far?
So I'm curious about the super duper uber pros Kona kind of top tens. So when they do intervals, training for Kona, they literally run like 20-minute intervals.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, well, it depends. They're going to run all sorts of, everything's on the table. So what's interesting about the pros is they're going to take things like 5K and 10K types of efforts, and they're going to put them at the end of their long runs. So their biggest, most key workouts start to look like, a long run married with somebody's 5K and 10K training plan. It's very crazy. And the types of intensity that they can do is off the charts. It's like watching somebody, do a 4-hour bike ride, and then the final hour is a 40K time trial. So really crazy stuff. Yeah. The pros, they have a lot more intensity and a lot more pushing it, redlining it. I don't know if you guys saw Lionel Sanders was posting something on Instagram today. He was doing some sort of testing with his aerobic capacity, and he was riding for somewhere around 30 minutes, 328 watts at a heart rate of 118 beats per minute. I mean, just absolutely insane.
He's
average. It's average.
He's also known for self-coaching, and other pros look at him and go, "What the hell? You're burning the candle at both ends, buddy." Too. So.
Amen.
He hasn't
I mean,
scratched the surface. That's what's crazy.
Yeah, and actually, as I was listening to him talk, it was funny because all I kept thinking as he's talking about these different things is, you sound really crazy. You sound off base for some of the stuff that you're doing, but yeah, I mean, he's tinkering, but hopefully, I think he do you guys know, has he gotten a coach at this point or no?
Yes, but he like half listens to him.
Yeah, it's already become a contentious relationship. But that was the funny thing, is that after Kona, when he did the whole thing, everybody was like, "That's great. I hope you get a coach now."
Yeah, right. Yep. So interesting. Well, I really want to see that guy do well. I really would like to see him win Kona, but it's.
Maybe you should reach out to him.
You know what? I like a lot of our age group athletes. So they're a little easier to work with. I need to butt heads. I think he'd be very challenging to coach.
He would require a lot of time.
Yeah, he would. He would require a lot of time. Not saying it would be worth it, but I'll try and.
You should ask Jerry Rodriguez about him. Apparently, Jerry's taught him how to swim.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I just got an email. It came through here. It said he's looking for Coach Megan Tobin and Coach Kyle. He wants to know if they're available. And I said I forward him on all your contact information.
I feel like he'd be a really good fit for Kyle.
Yeah, he said he heard Kyle's notes at Pacific, and he's going to be reaching out. You laugh now, but in the future, you'd be surprised who you'd be coaching. You have no idea. Laugh now. All right. Interval use cases. So real-time considerations, how much time, and the work-to-rest relationship. So if you're considering your work-to-rest relationship, a workout changes very quickly as soon as you start to manage and play around with the rest. So just simply going from 55% of FTP, let's say you're doing a bike workout, and your top, hard efforts are 1 minute on, 1 minute off, and suddenly you make the recovery period only 65% of FTP. You've now nudged up that IF dramatically. And if you even make it 75%, and the top end is maybe it's 115% that you're cranking along, that really changes the recovery profile of a workout like that. When you make the recovery very easy in between, you make it much more manageable, much more sustainable, much more able for the athlete to come back and do another workout the next day. So I wrote down all the common kind of work to rest relationships that we use at TriStar, as well as a lot of coaching platforms use these. So common ratios are 1 to 3 work to rest relationship, 1 to 2, 1 to 1, 2 to 1, and 3 to 1. So 1 to 3 is very common for VO2 max work, so really hard, high intensity intervals. Or it's basically 300% of the work is the work, so the rest is to the work. Very short rest would be more like 3 to 1, where you're only getting about 33%, but you can go even lower than that. But know that every time you compress the rest period, that you're bringing the body into a higher IF, and potentially you're also telling the body to come into shape. So I'll say that again. When you shrink the recovery period, you're telling the body to be able to come into shape, because it's more like time trialing and there's less recovery periods.
Wait, what do you mean by come into shape? I'm sorry. I don't understand what you're referencing.
Yeah. So when the body doesn't get recovery, you're basically forcing it to stay into these higher physiological patterns. So you're not coming out of, you may only dip out of heart rate zone 3 for a very short period of time before going back up again into some higher work rates. If you think about a workout that's a 1 minute on and 3 minutes of rest, 3 minutes is a long time to rest. So you could do a lot of intervals in that way. If you flip it around and you do 3 minutes on, 1 minute off, and you're going really hard for 3 minutes, are you really going to recover in those 60 seconds? No, not really. And so that means that you're almost time trialing, which when you start to do raised type of intensity like that with minimal rest, it's bringing the body, it's priming it for racing. It's bringing it into shape. So
Got it.
Yeah. And people make the mistake all the time of doing things like, I'm going to go and I'm going to do a track workout with this local running group, and I'm not in that great shape right now, so their rest is not nearly enough, and you're redlining the whole time. Your heart rate doesn't even come down below 155, and it's up in 170s and 180s, and you're looping around the track, and before you know it, you're completely gassed. And so you're basically saying, bring me into shape. It's going to be a very taxing and much harder workout to recover from, and so it'd be too strong. So you want to have, a workout that supports the recovery in between. If you're not recovering in between, then, you really are, you're going to either peak too soon, or you're going to miss time, trying to get into shape and peak for the event that you're trying to prepare for, basically, is what I'm trying to say. Does that make sense?
So when you're doing these intervals, and say you're doing one minute on, 2 minutes off, just so that I don't confuse them. So it's obvious when you don't hit the 1 minute. It's really obvious. It's like, oh, I'm not hitting that on but what if you can't hit, what if you have to go lower on the recovery? Does that mean bring your on down as well? Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I think the first thing you ask your athletes to do is to obviously bring the recovery down. Usually 55% or less, even if you went down to 40%, 30%, should help them. If they can't hit the high end, either their training stress balance is too high, or they didn't sleep enough, or they didn't eat enough, or their ramp rate in the last week or two has been just way too high, or they had one mega session that really cranked them.
Right, but if you're off 2 minutes, needs to be lower. So say it's supposed to be, I'm just picking percentages, say it's supposed to be 50%, and you're like, oh, I'm going down to 40%. Does that mean bring your on down as well?
Not if
Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, I think so.
Trying to go like this? Should you really be going like this?
You want to try to, so the goal should be to hit the energy system that's required, right, on the session. So if you have to drop down, you wouldn't want to drop down from, let's say, zone 5 to zone 4. If you're trying to do zone 5 work and you can do it with more recovery time or coming down on the recovery, that should be the first endpoint.
Okay.
If that doesn't work, then yeah, absolutely pull back on the top end as well. Sometimes you need both. And here's the real tricky part. You always want your athletes to try and continue the workout no matter what. You just don't, as long as they don't get sick or injured, they should go through it. They should go through that black hole, because if they don't, you don't get the benefit and you don't come out on the other side battle tested to go and then do it again and then have your body recover from that load and give you what you want next time. A lot of athletes, that's where they're going to fail and say, I threw in the towel, I can't do any more on this workout, way too hard, You should give them pause and tell them very encouragingly, hey, if you didn't hit it today, that just means that, you're managing up to your true potential for today, and, or maybe they didn't recover enough, but you need to help them figure that out. But as long as they're not going to get injured, and especially on the bike or in the swim, no consequence there. On the run, we got to be a little careful, because if we try and force the interval and we try and push it and form falls apart, injuries are going to start happening. So I think you guys have heard me say it. It's kind of like you're not growing the most when you're feeling like $1,000,000. You're growing the most when you feel crappy and tired and you feel like you can't get to that interval. All of the intervals that are in there are pie in the sky. If every day was perfect, that's what you'd be able to hit. But you know that you're managing up to your best of your ability if you're getting pretty darn close to it. Now, if you're way, way off base and you're going into this workout and you're like, this is crazy. I make none of these sessions. For a week, I haven't gotten anywhere on these. Then that's a whole different ballgame. And that means that, you're either have your thresholds wrong, or the load is wrong, or something is haywire in your athlete's life, and you got to go back and figure that out. Good question, though, because this is going to happen a lot. And I try to give a lot more athletes a lot more freedom these days to be doing some of their intervals, because it isn't, the mental aspect of this is that everything we do in training, exercising, is good. The question is it specific to what you're trying to get your athletes to do? And is it going to help them be better athletes, towards their goals in life? Yep. It's a good question, though, Suzanne, and good observation there. Okay, so what happens when your athletes do the intervals too hard? They're not necessarily getting much more bang for the buck. Not necessarily. If they go a whole octave or a whole zone higher than what you're asking them to do, and they're trying to give your coach like a wow, look at what I did kind of a thing, you're going to say to them, it's not great, because you're going to be tired from what you just did, or it's going to come back in you somewhere in the rest of the week. We can't go to the well that often and that deep. And if you can't wake up tomorrow and do another great session, then that's not great either. So you do want your athletes to be within reason, performing well. Sometimes I find like the freedom workouts are helpful to show you what your athletes are capable of. It's not a bad thing. We don't want to make them so restricted that they can't, go and outperform things. So sometimes it's okay. Running, you got to be a little bit more careful. You just got to always be mindful that, form breaks down when people run too hard and they get hurt. You're not warmed up enough. Biking and swimming, you can be a little bit more, a little bit more loose with that. So what happens when they do intervals too easy? They may not move the dial. They may get fitter, but they're not going to really raise their true potential. And I think one of the things bless you. One of the things I often look for our athletes to do their improvement is to get up into that 80%, because that's another way to really successfully move people along. Is if the main set, the intensity factor gets higher, we know that the athlete's going to start moving up in their threshold. Even if they're not necessarily doing threshold work, it's a good place to be. All right. What happens if they do the rest periods too hard? This is a real bad one. This is one that, I look at it and I say, you ran the intervals and then you ran the recoveries. Like, why did you do that? Because now it's a much harder workout than I prescribed. And it's not even so much that session. I know you can do it. That's not the point. The point is that the whole rest of the week hinges on you resting those intervals, because now it's going to come off somewhere else. You're gonna say, why did the athlete come to you on Sunday and say my long run, it was terrible? Well, why was it terrible? Well, because your heart rate never really recovered on some of those walking recoveries that were so easy. So there is a lot of interplay with intervals that are critical. And when you start to raise the intensity and you want your athletes to come into shape, then you're not going to want them to do things like walk the recoveries. You're going to want them to jog them. Very common in track workouts is to see walking recoveries in the off season if you're doing track workouts for more advanced folks, and then in peak season you're seeing your athletes jog or even keep a pretty steady pace before doing another repeat, like half-mile repeat or a mile repeat, that type of thing. What happens if your athlete does the DYOT, does their own thing? If they go off the reservation, I usually say you're taking a rest day, you're taking a swim day, and you may even take 2 days down. Totally fine, because you want your athletes to have a little flexibility in their life, and from time to time, it's going to happen. I think it's a good thing. I kind of like it once in a while, but you don't want them to get too far off the reservation, otherwise you're not going to be able to help them too much with the guidance. I put in here fartlek training, which kind of goes back to keeping the brain guessing. It's a neat pattern technique because it's just ad hoc intervals. So it's play running, they call it, and when you're running, you go really fast and surge for a few minutes, or maybe it's only 15-20 seconds, and then you come back down and you go up again, and it's completely frenetic. It's usually done with other athletes all together. You'll see, one person take the lead for a little bit. It's a really fun workout, but it does require athletes to be of the same ability. And you could create workouts such that you have you give them a 30-minute window to do the workout, and they should be alternating between 15, 20, and 30-second types of harder efforts at a perceived effort of a 7, let's say. And then their rest relationship is 200% for every on interval that they do. So if they, maybe did 30 seconds of running, then they have 2 minutes of recovery. But these are just kind of different things to get your coaching brains primed as to what is possible out there. And I think I skipped over this, but rest versus heart rate. Do you let it come down or don't you? And I think I touched on this a little bit, but in peak training, you don't necessarily want the heart rate to come back down. In fact, you want to hold it up or only come down somewhat. If you're doing, for instance, threshold work, where you're doing threshold pace work, your heart rate may not come all the way down, and that's okay in the final 5 weeks leading up to, let's say, your sprint race or your athlete's Olympic try or best 10K that they're trying to accomplish. But the rest of the season, it would be important to make sure the heart rate comes down. But then again, know your audience, and if you're talking about advanced athletes, sometimes these things may not even apply. Okay, other things about intervals. Interval training can improve many aspects of your human physiology and other reasons why we do it. So it can enhance the lactate threshold energy system, your VO2 max energy systems. These are super great things. I just remember, it's like a Molotov cocktail. Hold it carefully and don't drop it because it'll explode. Very, very volatile. Very good, very volatile. High risk, high reward. So I look at intervals as being very important. There's nothing wrong with doing low intensity intervals or moderate intervals to break things up. But when we talk about we're really engaging here, it's the high energy stuff for the most part. So intervals can help improve insulin action and sensitivity. Generating higher insulin sensitivity is good because lower insulin levels are needed to actually metabolize fat as a fuel source, which is good. Keeps our athletes lean. This is something obviously I know a lot about, but this is actually a very common thing and why athletes want to do this type of training. A combination of interval training and continuous exercise increases our cardiovascular fitness. It raises our HDL cholesterol, so our good cholesterol, which is also going to reduce the risk of heart disease. So a lot of people, right, they get into endurance sports because they want to feel fit, they want to get healthy, and this is why, you know, intervals are going to be helpful too. And lastly, I put in here, intervals can be a very effective tool for weight loss. So when you do very short, high intense threshold types of workouts or running for, like, let's say a minute or 2 minutes, and then you do very long recoveries for multiple hours after that, your body is actually going to now kick up its metabolism and burn even more fat. Now, there are weight loss programs when you guys have athletes that you're ready to work with that come to you and the first thing they need to do is lose weight. We have plans for that too. So, you know, we can engage that. And it's a combination of high intensity intervals within reason, weight bearing, quite a bit of gym work, which is helpful, and some really low intensity, heart rate based, pulmophotone type of running or cycling to help lose weight. So that is intervals in a nutshell, kind of like the overview. Questions? You guys still out there?
I wanted to mention a book that I saw mentioned by Dr. Maftone.
Great.
I don't know if, so this was probably 2-3 weeks ago. The book is called The Science and Application of High Intensity Interval Training.
This is a new book that just came out at all?
Yeah, it's brand new, and the doctor himself authored one of the chapters, and he claims that it is the best piece ever on the topic because it's written by proper scientists from around the world. So it's amazing. 20 other scientists contributed to the book, and it seems it's like a proper academic book. I think it's recommended for colleges and PhD programs. So it's probably not for the mere mortals, but and I tried to look it up, and you can't get it yet, and it's like $100.
Wow.
So it's the real deal. So if we ever want to go, super deep into high intensity interval training, the book exists now.
That's great. That's going to be something that I'll definitely look into. If you find the link, just pass it on to me in the chat here, so I can take it. I'd love to take a look at that.
Okay.
Yeah, and again, I'll say it again. A lot of these topics that we go through each week, we're really trying to get you first to be able to work with a wide range of endurance athletes and to be very versed and ready to coach people. So each one of these subjects is, a vertical that's deep, that has a lot of subject matter, and you could study this for the rest of your life. I have. It's something that I constantly am engaging in trying to find more and more information about things. So I think that's great. Share that, Tilla, if you would.
Yeah, I'm on a PC, so I can't do the chat thing, but I just emailed you the link.
Okay, perfect. All right, I think that's all I had on the subject of intervals, at least for tonight. Any other questions, thoughts, comments?
Your Ultraman says hello.
Oh yeah? Is he?
Yeah.
Is he?
Which one?
Well, my West Coast family, Julian, just texted me.